Please welcome to the stage, Carly DeFilippo.
So one of my favorite lost in translation stories is actually something that happened to a friend. She was on the Paris subway, also known as the metro, and this creepy guy started to bother her. So she mustered the courage to say, "Leave me alone," which in French is "laisse-moi." But what she actually said was, "Lèche-moi." That means lick me. Needless to say, the guy did leave her alone, but that's actually not the type of lost in translation moment I came to talk about today. I started learning French at the age of 7, so by the time I got to grad school in Paris, I knew the language pretty well. If there was a phrase or a word I didn't know, I'd look it up in the dictionary, just like in English. Except the longer I lived in France, the more my dictionary started to fail me. There were just concepts that existed in English that were hard to talk about in French, or phrases that existed in French that really didn't exist in English. Take, for example, this phrase in French, pas terrible. Literally, it means not terrible, so that should be pretty basic. Except when a French person says to you that, say, a restaurant is pas terrible, they mean it's really awful and you shouldn't go there. So this sarcasm built-in statement has always continued to bother me and confuse me even to this day. And when you start to look at different cultural values or cultural norms, things get even more complicated. One of my best friends in Paris was a vegetarian, so we'd go to a restaurant, especially those prix-fixe restaurants they love to have in Paris where you've got the 3 or 4 courses, and she would say, "Je ne mange pas la viande." I don't eat meat. Seems very simple yet again. Except then they would bring out the prix-fixe meal and she would get duck, because duck is not a meat in France. And even her own boyfriend didn't seem to understand this concept. It was her birthday and he made us pasta with carbonara sauce. She looked at him in confusion and he said, "Bacon is not a meat. Bacon is a flavor. It's a condiment." As someone who studies language, the thing that's most interesting for me still isn't these little moments of mix-up. It's when the cultural values get built into the language itself. The first time I was dating someone in France, I was really excited to cook for him. So I was making fish and vegetables, I bought some great bread and cheese, and he texts me this phrase, "Je risque d'être en retard." I risk to be late. What the hell does that mean? In English, when someone is running late, they usually say something like, "I missed the bus, it'll be 15 more minutes," or "My car broke down," or "I lost track of time, I'm so sorry." There's ownership, there's an explanation, and you usually have a sense of what's going on. In France, "Je risque d'être en retard." No further explanation. This guy was literally an hour late, and it wasn't because he was a jerk. In France, they just have a different concept of time. There's another phrase I usually talk about to underscore this, "j'arrive." Literally, I arrive. If an American texted this to you, they would be like 5 minutes away. In France, people text this to you when they're leaving their apartments. Yeah, so unless you live down the block, it's gonna be a while. I don't talk about these things to make fun of the French or French culture. I studied it, I love it, I'm a huge fan of the country. But as I've dabbled in other languages, from Dutch to Italian to Japanese, I've started to realize that those cultural values are built into all of these languages, even in the most basic everyday phrases. And as a writer and a brand strategist, I've also seen that this can happen when we're both speaking the same language. How many of you have worked with someone in English who just comes from another country or even another region of the United States? You've probably experienced what I'm talking about. The people we spend our time with, who we grow up with, they shape how we use language. So even if we're using the exact same words, we're not necessarily bringing the same meaning to the table. So when I'm working with clients, it's still my job to be a translator, even when they speak English, and most of them do. I find myself asking a lot of clarifying questions, thinking about what the context clues are based on the industry they're coming from or the way they talk about something. And most importantly, I try not to make assumptions that we're coming from the same place just because we speak the same language. So my invitation to all of you today is to practice your own skills as a translator, even in English. Whether that's with your clients or just, at the Thanksgiving table in the days to come, there's an opportunity for all of us to listen more deeply, to look for the subtle meaning, and not to focus just on what someone's saying on the surface level, but to think more about what they might actually be trying to say. Thank you.
So good, Carly.